Uh, Good morning, everyone. So glad to see everybody here for the first in a three-part series about fair housing. If you are looking for fair housing basics, you are in the right place. And as I said, this is a first in a three-part series about fair housing. This first session is really going to cover the basics of fair housing, what it is, why it's important, what communities need to know. We'll talk a little bit about some of the emerging issues in fair housing, and also talk a bit about some related issues, including local policies and the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And so one of the things that I just wanted to start off with is thanking, first of all, the Metropolitan Council for supporting this work, as well as folks who have been engaged and involved in helping guide some of this work, both formally and informally. In particular, Brianne from the City of Brooklyn Park, Nalimas Tate Munene from ACER, folks at the Met Council, folks from Family Housing Fund. It really was a pleasure to talk to everybody about what folks were looking for, as well as thanking everybody who was willing to tolerate my questions of them about what they wanted to know and what kind of workshop we really needed. So once again, thank you so much for that. So we're going to start off just doing a little bit of background on us, and then we'll do some welcome and introductions. So first of all, my name's Margaret Kaplan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the president of the Housing Justice Center. And the Housing Justice Center is a nonprofit public interest advocacy and legal organization whose primary mission is to preserve and expand affordable housing opportunities across Minnesota, and also to protect the rights of people who need affordable places to call home. And the first thing that would be fantastic for everybody to do. We have so many folks here, but if you could drop in the chat your name, your organization, what position you have, and your preferred pronoun. That would be fantastic, and then everybody will know kind of who's in the room this morning. As people are doing that, I also just wanted to give people a little bit of a heads up that we are going to be using a tool to share information a little bit here. I don't know how many folks are familiar with it's a Google tool that allows you to do the little Post-it notes on it. And so we have some kind of guiding questions that we're going to be using along the way. Pardon me? Oh, okay. So we are going to be having some guiding questions along the way, and so people will have an opportunity to participate and to share. One of the things that's really nice about this tool is it allows you to share anonymously. We are recording this session so that other people can be kind of involved in the conversation, but also really want to make sure that people have the freedom to ask the questions that they have, to say what's on their mind and what they're thinking about. Ellie, can you forward the presentation? And we already did that. Next one. Okay, so everybody's doing the chat box, name, organization, pronoun. Next slide. Okay, and so there are a couple of things that we just want to lay a little bit as a foundation for this conversation this morning. The first is everyone is kind of where they're at in their understanding of issues related to housing discrimination and fair housing. Everybody experiences the housing system differently. So we can't learn if we can't ask questions or really offer up what's in our minds. So it's really important for people to be able to do that. And at the same time, we know that people experience the housing system in different ways based on their identities and experiences. And so we also want to be really sensitive to people's issues and needs related to housing and fair housing and their own experience in the housing system. So different issues are just going to touch people differently. So we really need to be kind of respectful of each other in that regard. And I know everybody is going to be willing to do that. So next slide. Okay, so our first question, and Ellie, can you pop the link in the chat? This is going to be kind of our beta testing of our ability to use our technology today. And really the first question that we have for folks is, what does fair housing mean to you? And this does not have to be sort of a legal definition at all of fair housing. It's really, what does fair housing mean to you? And let's see here. And let me go back, make sure. Okay. So, so Ellie dropped the link in the Jamboard to the Jamboard in the chat. Please let me, and I'll drop it again. Please let me know if you have trouble navigating on Jamboard. So the way that Jamboard works is over on the left-hand side of the page, you can create a sticky note. And you can write anything you want to on a sticky note. And then if you post it, if you hit save, it'll post the sticky note, and then you can move it around. So on the first page of our Jamboard, put in sticky notes, what does fair housing mean to you? And we'll give people a couple minutes to get their notes in. And don't worry about moving around your own Post-its, because we can do that for you as well too. You can if you want to. Great. Okay. Well, we are going to oops, let's see here. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Okay. So there are a couple of themes that are emerging in this. And I know some people some people had trouble getting into the Jamboard, but we have a number of different themes that really came up in this. You know, the first is this idea of equal access to housing, equal access to opportunity, access to housing that is available to everyone. There are also folks who pulled out some different issues as well too, including issues of safety and equity, issues of not being discriminated against, accessibility, identity not being a barrier to housing issues, respect, being treated equally, housing access for everybody. So in other words, sort of across the board, we've got these themes that are really related to sort of equitable access regardless of who you are. And I am going to, G-A-Y-L-O-R, sorry, having a technical issue here. And so one of the things that I want to note here is that there are some things that people put in the Jamboard that are kind of about legal rights. And there are other things that are really about values, right? And so when we think about housing and we think about equitable housing opportunities and fair housing opportunities, we should think a little bit about sort of why these concepts exist and where they come from. So the law then, and the Federal Fair Housing Act and other associated anti-discrimination laws are tools, right, that have definitions in the law, but they're really designed with this idea of following a set of values that everybody in a community should be able to access safe, stable housing that they can afford in the community of their choice, free from discriminatory barriers. Okay. So Ellie, do you want to go back to the PowerPoint? Okay, and next slide. So as we're saying, fair housing is really based on a set of laws that were created and a set of values that kind of undergird what those laws are. So it's really intended to, once again, create this objective of everybody having access to the same types of opportunities in communities. And that should happen regardless of people's various kinds of identities or the protected class that they're in. Next slide. So I'm going to ground us a little bit way back in history, not that long ago. This is a detail of Native American nations here in Minnesota from Aaron Carapella from Tribal Nations Maps. He has put together some very beautiful maps. There's a variety of different ones that really show who was living in these communities first. And I think one of the things that we have to realize as we think about housing and housing rights is there is nothing preordained or inevitable about who has ownership of land, who has access to certain sets of rights that are associated with having title to the properties, and that all of the land at one point in time was stolen from Native American communities. And so this idea that there is some sort of higher set of rights or an inevitability because somebody has a title to a property is really based on a history, and that history is deeply discriminatory. Next slide. So why is fair housing a particularly pressing issue here in Minnesota? What's unique here in Minnesota? One of the first reasons why fair housing is so pressing today is that Minnesota has the worst homeownership disparities in the country, particularly the Twin Cities. Now, you can quibble about whether we're first or third worst, but it really doesn't matter that much because it's bad regardless. Second, Minnesota and the Twin Cities have persistent patterns of residential segregation that are built on a history of decisions that were made really across our housing system, from zoning and planning to lending, restrictive covenants, decisions that were made against certain protected classes that allowed some people to access certain communities and other people to not access those communities. And lastly, that there are vast disparities in income and in housing costs burden. So right now in the state of Minnesota, Black households are over 3 times as likely to be severely housing cost burden as white renter households, for example. And just to kind of show a little bit how this plays out, this is from Minnesota Housing Partnerships Market Watch. It shows a couple of different things. The first set of pie charts is showing the percentage of households who are renter households. So you sort of see playing out that while only 26% of white households are renters and the remainder are homeowners, 76% of Black households and 59% of Latinx households are renters. And then of those renters, the second set of pie charts shows the percentage who are considered housing cost burden. So that means people who are paying more than 30% of their income for their housing costs. And very persistently, you'll see kind of across the board that renters are housing cost burden, but this also falls heaviest on Black, Indigenous, and Latinx households, where you see less housing costs burden in white and Asian households here in the Twin Cities. Next slide. So I'm going to go a little bit into the history of some of the fair housing laws, because I think it's really sort of important to think about the origins of some of this. And by the way, these are also things that still have an impact and have an effect. Really the first law that is sort of still in effect, that remains sort of a cornerstone of fair housing, actually comes out of the Reconstruction era. And that's the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And basically what it said is that all citizens of the United States, and note that this just applies to citizens in every state, shall have the same rights as white citizens to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, or convey real or personal property. Now, it may be completely unsurprising to folks to know that this was a law that really was applied somewhat unequally. When you think about the way that people were able to access and sort of enjoy and convey real and personal property. For example, even if you think about decisions that were made by the federal government with regards to mortgages through the Department of Veterans Affairs or the FHA insurance of mortgages, you begin to sort of see where this was a somewhat incomplete stab at trying to make housing rights available to people kind of regardless of, in this case in particular, race. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was really focused principally on race because this was the Reconstruction era, but it didn't have a ton of teeth to it. Now, there were a number of cases that were brought in states around the country that did sort of open the doors for people, particularly when it came to place-based discrimination, residential discrimination. However, once again, they didn't have a lot of teeth to it. Next slide. So then we come to sort of the setup for the Federal Fair Housing Act. Now, in 1964, the first Civil Rights Act was created, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was really designed to be sort of the next step in civil rights. When it was originally passed, it didn't apply to everything. It focused on race, color, religion, and national origin. It was later expanded to include sex in 1974, and in 1988, it was expanded to include disability and family status. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was something that was very, very hard fought. It succeeded in the Senate by a very narrow majority, and it was expected in many ways to get significantly watered down by the House of Representatives, which at the time was had sort of a lot of influence from Southern segregationist Democrats. And it subsequently, though, with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, was really embraced by people in a different way, I think, because folks were sort of realizing the presence of the moment and how important it was. That said, it still is a law that at times has had a bit of a rocky path. And there have certainly been attempts to at times water it down, ignore the provisions of the Federal Fair Housing Act, or otherwise try and sort of limit the application of the Federal Fair Housing Act. The other thing I would say is that it does evolve over time as well, too. So currently, the Fair Housing Act explicitly prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, and family status. There are a couple of these that are pretty self-evident, but there are others that need a little bit of additional explanation, I think, for folks to sort of really understand what they were getting at when they passed it. Next slide, please. In particular, one that I think sometimes confounds people a little bit, because it's in sort of a different place in the Federal Fair Housing Act than the initial statement, and that's disability. So disability under the Federal Fair Housing Act means a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities, a record of having such an impairment, or being regarded as having such an impairment. One of the things I'd like to note there, because I think that this is really important when you think about all of the protected classes under the Federal Fair Housing Act, is the being regarded as having. So very often when we see things that are discriminatory, it's whether somebody is part of a protected class or is perceived as being part of a protected class. So discrimination can happen even when somebody does not themselves identify under one of the protected classes that were listed. Next slide, please. So another, I think, really important issue, and this is sort of had a little bit of up and down just in terms of how it applies, is the prohibition against sex discrimination. As you'll note, that was not initially included in the Federal Fair Housing Act and was added in 1974. And then there were a number of cases about what it meant to discriminate against somebody on the basis of sex. And it was not until 2020 that the Supreme Court held that that included sexual orientation and gender identity. So that was a very recent Supreme Court decision that then was in 2021 sort of put into an executive order about how HUD would address discrimination that was based on gender identity or sexual orientation. And then finally, the Office of Fair Housing issued a memorandum that really explained how they were going to address actual or perceived or discrimination because of actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity under the Federal Fair Housing Act. Now, one thing I'd like to note is that Minnesota was in some ways a little bit ahead of its time on that because some of these concepts were actually incorporated into the Minnesota Human Rights Act significantly earlier than they became clear under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And you'll see that somewhat kind of across the page in terms of the way that states and local jurisdictions think about housing discrimination. So the Federal Fair Housing Act is kind of a floor in some ways, But states through human rights acts and local jurisdictions through their anti-discrimination and fair housing policies can have rights that are stronger than what exists under the Federal Fair Housing Act. Next slide. So there are also some additional groups that may have protections under the Federal Fair Housing Act based on the relationship between their identity or their circumstances and one of the named protected classes. For example, people with limited English proficiency, very frequently that gets pulled into the category of national origin, right? And so that's one way that you can sort of expand our kind of definition or understanding of what types of rights people have. Another that comes up quite frequently is survivors of domestic violence. So there are some specific laws that are related to like VAWA, for example, that are related to people who have experienced domestic violence, but also fair housing has been used as kind of a hook because very frequently domestic violence is tied to discrimination based on sex. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to go back to our Jamboard for a moment with two things. One is, and you can kind of toggle through the slides on the Jamboard along the top. Two things. One is on slide 2, we have kind of a parking lot for questions. I know that I talk kind of fast, and also want to make sure that we're not missing anything as we go along. So this is where people can parking lot their questions. But the next slide, which is the question that we have in front of us, is as you think about the different protected classes and what the Federal Fair Housing Act sort of does, whose actions, as you think about your experience in your community, interacting with individuals, developers, landlords, tenants, homeowners, whose actions are covered by the Federal Fair Housing Act? And you can just stick your stickies on the Jamboard. And people can keep adding if they want to, but you're right. It's and more so. So pretty much anybody who is interacting with the housing system in any way is going to have actions that are going to be covered in one way or another by the Federal Fair Housing Act. You know, most frequently we hear about it with banks and realtors, landlords, service providers, government agencies, cities, counties, the state, HUD itself. So it really is very broad, just in terms of, whose activities are going to be covered by this. I think one of the things that folks have put in the chat, which is a really important one, and one that comes up very, very frequently, and we'll talk about this actually a lot more in our next session, which is going to be focused on mostly like city activities and what cities can do in response to the Federal Fair Housing Act and other anti-discrimination policies. That's inspectors and regulatory divisions. That's one that we see very, very frequently. So it is a very, very expansive policy, which covers the activities of a lot of different entities and protects the rights of a lot of different people in many, many different ways. Let's go back into our PowerPoint. And next slide. So that being said, there are a few really narrow exceptions to the Federal Fair Housing Act, which doesn't mean these exceptions apply to all housing, because they can also be further sort of limited by state law and local policies as well too. The first, though, is owner-occupied housing, and so you can't enforce the Federal Fair Housing Act against somebody who's looking for a roommate, for example. There are some examples for temporary or transient housing. Now, that being said, because it applies to dwellings, that being said, there are different cases that have expanded what a dwelling means at different times. So for example, hotels and motels may not be included in the Federal Fair Housing Act as a dwelling, but they're probably going to be included under different civil rights laws that limit preventing people from accessing public accommodations. So in other words, just because something isn't under the Federal Fair Housing Act doesn't mean it isn't covered by other civil rights laws. Another one that comes up every once in a while is housing for members of religious organizations, where they can make some exceptions for people who are of a specific religion. And then in some ways, one of the more complicated exceptions, which is a semi-exception, is housing for older persons. So I know not everybody loves the terminology housing for older persons, but it is exempted from renting to families with children, so that familial status, if it meets certain conditions. So if 100% of the units are occupied by persons 62 or older, or if 80% are occupied by households where at least one person is 55 or older, or if HUD has determined that the funding for it is part of a state or federal program specifically designed or operated to assist elderly people. So that's one of the reasons why you'll see some housing, that senior housing, that isn't necessarily going to be covered by the familial status part of the Federal Fair Housing Act. However, that doesn't mean that that they aren't covered by other parts of the Federal Fair Housing Act. Can you clarify, if this housing can exempt families with children, does it mean they have to? No, it doesn't. And so very frequently we will see examples where folks have housing that is sort of marketed towards seniors, but it's not falling under the definition that would have the exemption. And a lot of the times you'll see this because 55 or older, a lot of times there are people who are 55 or older who have children themselves. Right? And so they don't have to exempt households with children. Next slide, please. So there are really two types of housing discrimination that, or two kind of major causes of action under the Federal Fair Housing Act. So there is disparate treatment and there is disparate impact. And I think it's important for people to know about both of them, because one is really about intent and the other is about sort of the outcomes or the consequences of decisions that are being made. So the first one we'll talk about, and we see this all the time still, is disparate treatment. So that's treating somebody differently because she or he or they are a member of a protected class. And sometimes we think about this kind of as like the smoking gun, right? That somebody has said something that's discriminatory, that they've done something that is discriminatory, and it appears to be intentional. Now, disparate treatment doesn't always need that like really clear smoking gun statement or policy in order to show that it is discriminatory under the Federal Fair Housing Act. It can really be demonstrated in two different ways. So the first is direct evidence of discriminatory intent. And then the second is demonstrating a prima facie case of discrimination. Next slide, please. So direct evidence of discriminatory intent. Like I said, these are the things that very frequently we think about sort of as the smoking gun, right? That thing that you see that you know is discriminatory. So a lot of the times we'll hear about this in the context of advertising or making statements that indicate a preference or a limitation or discrimination. Now, it doesn't have to be a direct statement saying, I am not going to rent to you. A lot of the time, the advertising or marketing will involve using things that are kind of proxies for a protected class, you know, whether it's race or its family status. These are things that can happen somewhat subtly, but still could be evidence of discriminatory intent. Another example that comes up very often, and a lot of the time this isn't when it's not where somebody is going to be super blatant about it, but if you have a policy that only allows families with children to rent units on the first floor of a building, or only allows families with children to rent in a specific building or at the back of the building. A lot of the time, the rationale for it will be something like noise or access, and yet that still can be evidence of discriminatory intent. One of the things that's important to note about discriminatory intent is it doesn't necessarily have to include animus. It's not that you necessarily are hating on people of a particular protected class, but it's that you intend to treat people of a protected class differently than people who are not of that protected class. One of the classic examples is only showing households in predominantly Black neighborhoods to Black home buyers. So that is residential steering that we hear so often. One that is kind of a more recent, because the ADA only passed in 1991 and sort of expanded rights for people with disabilities. If you are building multifamily housing with 4 or more units, it needs to be accessible and usable to people with disabilities. And there are actually some very sort of specific criteria that are included in what it means to be accessible and usable to people with disabilities. It includes things like, for example, is it, yes, we will get to that in a moment. Source of income. Is it accessible to people like the entryways? Is there ability to structure in things like grab bars? In other words, it's not that every unit has to have all of the elements of being fully accessible to somebody with every disability, but it needs to be designed in a way where the building can be accessible to people with disabilities and that reasonable accommodations can be included in those units. And once again, that applies to buildings that were built 1991 and later. Another that there was actually a very recent case about here in Minnesota that I believe is on the cusp that has a consent decree, and that is demanding sexual favors in exchange for repairs. You might be surprised to hear how often that gets utilized, and that is considered a form of discrimination based on sex, as well as in violation of numerous other laws. Next. So as I mentioned, there's sort of the smoking gun approach, and then there's the prima facie case approach. So prima facie case for intentional discrimination is where you are able to prove a case of discrimination using circumstantial evidence. Now, this is kind of a tricky area, and I know not everybody's role is going to go out and like sue people for Fair Housing Act violations. But I wanted to provide an example of this. And this is an example that's about terms and conditions of an agreement for real estate. So this is a sort of a classic, like, what is a prima facie case? So the first thing you have to show is that the complainant to HUD, or the plaintiff if you're going to the courts, is a member of a protected class. So they have rights under the Federal Fair Housing Act. The second is that they inquired about or applied for housing from the respondent. So for example, they're a tenant, they applied for a rental housing unit. The third is that the respondent imposed unfavorable or less favorable terms or conditions. So in other words, yes, I will lease this unit to you, but only if you agree to these specific things. And those are less favorable or they're unfavorable. And then the last, you have to show that the respondent, in other words, the defendant, didn't impose the same kinds of terms or conditions on people who are similarly situated and not of the complainant's protected class. So in other words, there are some things where there may be differences in a lease agreement, for example, about the amount of a security deposit that somebody is paying. That could be at times justified because somebody is not necessarily similarly situated, right? The key here, though, is that people who are otherwise similarly situated would have a different set of terms or conditions than somebody who is not a member of the complainant's protected class. So a question in the chat that came up, is everyone a member of a protected class? No, they're not. And just because you're a member of a protected class doesn't necessarily mean too that you'd be able to show a prima facie case of discrimination as well. So once again, coming back to those 7 protected classes. Now, everybody could potentially at some point in their lives be perceived as being a member of a protected class. So it doesn't necessarily, what your actual identity is might not be the thing that determines whether you're being discriminated against. And some people sometimes are and aren't, right? As people's life circumstances change, for example, as people get older, sometimes they will develop disabilities, I think is a really good example, or familial status, right? You know, when you're 20 years old, you might not have kids. When you're 25, you might. When you're 40, you know, they may be living with grandma or something like that. So people don't always have the same protected class status throughout their lives. Okay, next slide. So say you have proven up your prima facie case of discrimination. You've gone through those elements, you've been able to prove it. So if you show a prima facie case using circumstantial evidence, that doesn't mean you win. What happens is the burden shifts. So the respondent has to demonstrate that there's some legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for his, her, or their action. And then the courts are going to look at whether the legitimate non-discriminatory reason is a pretext for intentional discrimination. So once again, you have this thing where you're like proving up discrimination, then it kind of goes into their court to prove it's not. And then the courts or the decision makers at HUD are going to examine whether that is a real reason or kind of a fake reason. Next slide. So the other kind of discrimination, and I would say this is the one we tend to hear the most about, because a lot of the times those intentional discrimination cases, particularly when you have a smoking gun, they become a news item and then they very quickly go away because it's really clear that discrimination is occurring. And that is the distinction between disparate treatment and disparate impact. So disparate treatment is that you have to prove that the defendant intended to discriminate. And one of the best quotes about that is in the city of Blackjack, which is 8th Circuit. So that is the same circuit that Minnesota is in. It is enough for the complaining parties to show that local officials are effectuating the discriminatory design of private individuals. So this was kind of a planning and zoning case, like so many fair housing cases are, that people were complaining they didn't want affordable housing in the community, and they were able to prove that it was the discriminatory statements by people in the community that really drove the city officials to make choices that were disparate treatment of people from protected classes. But the second is disparate impact. And that is that a practice has a discriminatory effect where it actually or predictably results in a disparate impact on a group of persons, or creates, increases, reinforces, or perpetuates segregated housing patterns because of race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, or national origin. And you'll hear a lot about sort of disparate impact being less about they said this thing and more the predictable result of their actions was to create something where people of similarly situated but of different protected classes ended up with different results. Next slide. So one, I'm going to come back to Blackjack because it has, I think, one of the best quotes that sort of encompasses disparate impact and what it means and why it's so important. So it says, effect and not motivation is the touchstone, in part because clever men may easily conceal their motivations, but more importantly, because whatever our law once was, we now firmly recognize that the arbitrary quality of thoughtlessness can be as disastrous and unfair to private rights and the public interests as the perversity of a willful scheme. So in other words, this idea that it doesn't have to be the intent to discriminate that leads to discrimination, but instead the failure to pay attention to or care for what the results were of decisions that were being made. And then most recently, and this is another one that was really associated with decisions about where housing was placed, where it was funded. And this was the case that really, where the Supreme Court said that disparate impact is a thing under the Federal Fair Housing Act, even though this had been a cause of action for a very long time, and all the circuits said, yes, disparate impact is a thing. And that's Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities Project. And it says suits targeting unlawful zoning laws and other housing restrictions that unfairly exclude minorities from certain neighborhoods without sufficient justification are the heartland of disparate impact liability. So they really, for the first time, you had the Supreme Court saying, yes, disparate impact actually really exists. Next slide. So disparate impact really has sort of had its ups and downs in terms of how it is proven and how it is regulated. There was a very clear three-part test that was adopted by HUD in 2013. And then the Trump administration decided that they wanted to get rid of that, replace it with something else. Many people sued. The courts enjoined that. So the 2013 regulations were back in effect, because those were the regulations that existed before the new version was enjoined. And now, subsequently, these regulations have been sort of like reintroduced. But this is actually the test that had existed for a really long time before that as well, too, in virtually every circuit court. So the first thing that the plaintiff or the complainant, if they're complaining to HUD, has to do is they have to prove actual or threatened adverse impact of the defendant's actions. A lot of the times this is proven via statistics, because that's the information you have available. Like, what are the actual impacts or the potential impacts of a decision that's being made, whether it is by a bank or a landlord or a government actor. The second is the defendant can prove that the challenge practice is necessary to achieve one or more substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory interests. You will recognize that language a little bit from the prima facie case in intentional discrimination. And then finally, even if you can prove that there is a reason for doing it, that is substantial, legitimate, and non-discriminatory, the plaintiff can still win if they're able to show that whatever those objectives are of the defendant could be served by another less discriminatory practice. So a practice that would not have the same discriminatory effect as the practice that was adopted. And so once again, this is kind of the three-part test that you'll hear about a lot as you think about this issue of disparate impact and how different policies or practices affect people of protected classes differently. Next slide. So we're going to go back to our Jamboard. And one of the things, and it take a couple minutes to do that, as you think about your work and your community, what are some of the ways or the examples of housing discrimination? What types of housing discrimination or Fair Housing Act violations do you see? So what are the most common circumstances or issues that come up in your own work and in your own world? And I'll give people maybe about 3 or 4 minutes. Okay. Along with the things in the Jamboard, we also have a few things that people popped up in the chat as well too. I know Jamboard is not the friendliest tool for everyone. That includes HOAs fighting multi-unit low-income development projects, often citing increased concentration of people of color and their associated fear of increased crime, lower quality of life, Tisch reports not being enforced, potentially familial status, when and to what extent a unit of a certain size can be reserved for a household of a certain size, also occupancy limits and overcrowding enforcement, more dominant culture, affluent neighbors resisting group homes located in area due to held disability / mental health stigmas and bias, um, inspecting not done prior to closing, knowing there are existing issues. Also, people brought up a lot of issues related to disparate treatment or different levels of response from management and management companies, negative media reports, making some areas of city less desirable, response times for maintenance requests, reasonable accommodations in rental units not being done, prioritization of well-being of some people over others, and one that we'll talk a little bit about more when we talk about the Minnesota Human Rights Act in particular, and that is not accepting Section 8 as having a disparate impact, because that's kind of a tricky one in some ways, but there's definitely some developing issues or law on that. Different terms and conditions for different tenants. Yeah, and those are all really sort of primary examples of the kinds of fair housing violations that exist here in the Twin Cities metro area. Others that we see pretty commonly. Oh, can you talk a little bit about Tisch reports and inspections prior to closing on a mortgage? So I have to admit that I have very limited knowledge of Tisch reports and inspections prior to closing on a mortgage. So you may be able to add more to the conversation about that than I can, and certainly happy to hear anything that's going to be useful about that. I will say one of the things that we've seen really increasingly happening in the single family space is sort of the emergence of real estate investment trusts or other types of cash buyers who are buying up a lot of single family homes for rental property or in order to flip them without any type of inspection and no conditions on them. And because those are folks who are cash buyers, they don't have any requirements for inspecting the home in order to get the financing. And one of the challenges in particular for lowest income households is that a lot of the programs that give people access to homeownership opportunities have inspection requirements baked into them, and for very good reason, right? You don't want to buy something that is going to cost a lot of money or be a lot of trouble or fall down around you or have an additional increased added expense that you cannot support. So having an inspection before closing on a house is really important for people's financial well-being. And at the same time, particularly in a really hot housing market, it's very, very difficult for buyers who need inspections to be able to compete with buyers who will buy houses sometimes sight unseen using cash with no inspection requirements. So that can be create sort of another barrier then to accessing homeownership opportunities and for addressing homeownership disparities. But I'm wondering if there's anybody else who wants to speak a little bit to TISH reports and inspections prior to closing on a mortgage? Well, what we can do is we can kind of bank it in the in our parking lot and come back around to it then maybe in our next session a little bit. Oh, Ashley has a hand up.
Hey, Margaret. Thank you
Hi.
for leading this session. It's been so amazing. I think that in terms of inspections, it has been a challenge for, oh, shoot. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical issues. I'm going to put it in the parking lot. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. We will eagerly await it in the chat. And a couple of people have mentioned in the chat as well too that this discussion is sort of reminds folks of the current Blue Line light rail project, the Blue Line extension, which can create access in particular to areas of our city that haven't always had great access, and at the same time that it lacks support in some communities due to affluent residents claims of increased crime. And that's something that is not uncommon when you see the build out of transportation projects or the creation of affordable housing, where you'll have folks who will raise issues and concerns based on really misperceptions about increases in crime. Another thing that you will hear an awful lot about is parking. And then sometimes the other one that you'll hear is schools. Very often the parking, schools, and crime conversations really are kind of a proxy and not a very subtle one. So it's coded language that's based on race, disability status, familial status, things like that. There's also, interestingly, a flip side to those conversations as well too. And this has been, when you think along the emerging Blue Line, yes, traffic concerns, traffic. It's always parking and traffic. For some reason, these concerns rarely come up when people are building higher end housing, because apparently higher income people don't have cars. Who knew? But at any rate, parking and traffic. Another thing that's come up though along the Blue Line, which I think is a really important consideration, is there is a flip side, and that is in some of the communities in North Minneapolis, the Blue Line is coming through. People see the benefit of it, but also there are some significant fears of displacement associated with the development of the Blue Line as well too. And so one of the things I think communities are grappling with is, how do you make sure as these significant amenities come into communities, they're accessible to the people who are there, who do not become subsequently displaced? And so that becomes the driver of a lot of the conversations about anti-displacement policy. And so that's going to actually be one of our primary topics in our third session, when we talk about how to expand the rights of people who need access to fair housing. Really looking at some of those anti-displacement policies and other ways that you can basically mitigate both intentional discrimination, but also some of those subsequent effects that happen either because of actors who are acting in a discriminatory manner, or because of sort of these collections of series of decisions that are made as we think and plan for the future of development in communities. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint and hit the next slide. So here are a couple examples of fair housing challenges in city planning. As I've mentioned, Blackjack, which has some of my favorite quotes. It was at issue was a zoning ordinance that allowed no multifamily housing, really intended to prevent subsidized housing development. And it would block about 85% of metro area Black households from being able to have housing opportunities in the town of Blackjack because of who was a renter and who was an owner. The second is a really famous fair housing case in the city planning context, and that is Mount Holly Garden Citizen versus the town of Mount Holly. And this was about a city redevelopment project where the city was going to tear down an affordable housing development where 32% of Hispanic or Latinx households in Mount Holly would be adversely affected, but only like less than 3% of white households. And what was subsequently being created, only 21% of African-American or Hispanic households in county would be able to afford the new market rate housing compared to 79% of white households. And so this is actually a pretty prominent case just in terms of like city planning and development in terms of like how fair housing then plays into the decisions that people are making. Next slide. So how is the Federal Fair Housing Act enforced? So there are two kind of pathways that people typically take when they're raising a fair housing claim. The first is administratively. So HUD has an office of fair housing where they do take complaints. Individuals or organizations can file a fair housing complaint with HUD, and then HUD will investigate the complaint and make a finding. And one of the things that I think it's really important to note is it doesn't have to be the people who are being discriminated against who file a fair housing complaint. Anybody can file a fair housing complaint who sees discrimination happening in a community. And once again, it can be individuals, it can be groups of individuals, it can be organizations, it can be cities or other government entities. So they go through sort of this administrative process. I will say the administrative process at HUD is very, very slow. And sometimes it will take years before you get a determination. The second route that people can take is they can go directly to the courts. So individuals or organizations or cities or other entities can file a case in court. Typically speaking, because it is a federal law, it would be filed in federal court. However, sometimes there are exceptions to that. Frequently, there are multiple different kind of causes of action that are part of a discrimination case. And so sometimes people will have a lot of state court claims as well as federal claims, and they'll file it in state court. As long as it has those federal claims, it can and frequently is removed to federal court. One thing that's really important to note is you don't need permission or a finding from HUD to file a case under the Federal Fair Housing Act. It's sort of a misperception that some people have that you have to kind of exhaust your administrative remedies with HUD to file a Federal Fair Housing Act case. That actually isn't true. And even if you have a finding from HUD that disagrees with you, you can still go to court and you can still go through the court process. The ones that we hear about the most tend to be issues that are running through the court system, but HUD is getting fair housing complaints literally all the time. Which is one of the reasons why sometimes it does take a while. One of the things I will say, though, is both for fair housing claims as well as claims under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, a lot of people don't know that they have access to the ability to file complaints with HUD. Tends to be a little bit of an understood or underrepresented set of issues. And in fact, in some conversations that I had a couple of years ago with folks from the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, and this has changed a bit subsequently, but they weren't receiving a lot of Human Rights Act complaints, even though there were a lot of people who were really concerned about violation of their rights under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And despite other pervasive discrimination and disparities that existed in the housing system, the most common complaints that they were receiving were actually about reasonable accommodation, and very frequently related to presence of service animals. So, just because people aren't complaining to the entities doesn't mean that the discrimination isn't happening. It's frequently about barriers to access to information about what rights people have. And also sometimes I'll say it is frustration with the speed with which some of these issues get addressed or resolved. When people are experiencing discrimination, frequently it's very challenging for them to be in the position of being a complainant or being a plaintiff. And people really often want to get on with the next stage in their lives and are concerned about their current situation and their current housing stability. So in all of these processes, that you have a lot of the burden placed on the people who are experiencing discrimination to raise the issues and fight for their rights to be free from discrimination, which is it's really challenging, and it means that a lot of discrimination then kind of goes forward unaddressed. Next slide, please. So another thing that is, and we're going to talk about this issue a lot more in our third session as we talk about sort of expansiveness of the rights to housing, and that is the duty to affirmatively further fair housing. So one of the things that the Act says is it's not enough to just sort of passively hope that fair housing exists. But when entities receive money for programs, including like federal dollars from HUD, they have the responsibility to affirmatively further fair housing. At a minimum, so it started out as applied to HUD, means that HUD, as they're taking their actions, has to consider the proposed policies and purposes of the Federal Fair Housing Act. Interestingly, one of when Housing Justice Center was just beginning as the Housing Preservation Project, one of the very first cases that we brought was about the duty to affirmatively further fair housing in a case against HUD for decisions that they were making where they were not taking sufficient actions to preserve federally subsidized affordable housing. So they were letting a lot of properties out of the programs without using either their regulatory or their financial resources. And that subsequently led to a lot of changes just in terms of the way that HUD acted affirmatively further fair housing. So in NAACP versus HUD, the need for such consideration itself implies, at a minimum, an obligation to assess negatively those aspects of a proposed course of action that would further limit the supply of genuinely open housing, and to assess positively those aspects of a proposed course of action that would increase the supply. And a number of people have talked about this issue of supply being like really fundamental, supply of affordable housing being very fundamental to addressing the housing needs of people from protected classes. And this is really a direction to say HUD has to take that in mind as they're making their choices about their programs. Next slide. And so one of the sort of manifestations of that is under the regulations for the community development block grant. And I know that a lot of folks on this webinar either directly or indirectly are receiving CDBG funds. And one of the things that the regulations say is it has to be conducted and administered in conformity with the Fair Housing Act and the guarantee to affirmatively further fair housing. And so initially, it was in CDBG, home, few other regulations. Now, this is one of those issues where affirmatively further fair housing has had very squishy definitions over time, right? And so at one point in time, in 2015, anybody who's been in government for a while knows that HUD released some pretty explicit regulations about what it means to affirmatively further fair housing. And then during the Trump administration, HUD essentially gutted the affirmative furthering fair housing rule. So they kind of got rid of those regulations. But then because of the change in administration since 2021, the 2015 regulations are sort of partially in effect. And one of the things that we're all waiting for with bated breath is for the administration to release the new guidance on affirmatively furthering fair housing. That is imminent. I don't know exactly when, but we should be expecting the new AFFH guidance really honestly almost any day now. The other thing, if you are a housing nerd like I am, you've certainly heard of the Westchester County cases. There have been a large series of cases from the Anti-Discrimination Center. And one of the things that they did is they actually sued, saying that by certifying their compliance with the CDBG regulations related to affirmatively furthering fair housing, that Westchester County was violating the Federal False Claims Act because they said they were affirmatively furthering fair housing, but were creating no affordable housing. And so they really took an issue that the county had accessed over $50 million in CDBG funds and certified that they were using it properly to affirmatively further fair housing, where they weren't actually creating any fair housing at all. And ultimately it was settled with an affordable housing production plan by the county. Now, one of the things I would note is, every time one of these cases settles or comes to some sort of resolution, frequently that is just kind of the start of the fight. People will continue to have to regulate and monitor. And as consent decrees sort of expire, sometimes they haven't reached all of their promise. So particularly when it comes to issues related to zoning and planning, these tend to have a very, very long life to them. One that I would point out that's very relevant here is that the Holman consent decree, which really came out of a fair housing case about the concentration of public housing in North Minneapolis in what's now the Heritage Park neighborhood. That consent decree was in place, and there were like Holman vouchers, which were sort of authority for replacement units for Holman for the development that was raised as a result of the Holman case. Those vouchers and compliance of that went on for really over a decade. And so once again, these things never end when they end, right? Because people are still experiencing discrimination in the housing system. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So there are more in Minnesota than just claims under the Federal Fair Housing Act. The other one that I think is really important for people to know a little bit about is the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And there are two sections that I think are particularly relevant for people who care about issues related to housing discrimination. The first is just subdivision 1 that articulates that is unfair and discriminatory to basically discriminate against people's right to rent, lease, sell real property. And you will note that the protected classes are more expansive than the protected classes under the Federal Fair Housing Act. So this includes race, color, creed, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, status with regard to public assistance, disability, sexual orientation, or familial status. A number of people have raised that question about Section 8 housing choice vouchers. And when you look at the plain language of the Minnesota Human Rights Act, it explicitly says status with regard to public assistance. And it goes further to define status with public assistance with regard to public assistance to include housing supports. But we'll get back to that in just a moment. Next slide. The other section of the Minnesota Human Rights Act that's particularly relevant when you think about housing in local communities and the government's role is access to public service. So it's unfair or discriminatory practice to discriminate against a person in the access to admission to full utilization or the benefit from any public service. This is something that comes up fairly regularly when we talk about issues related to both access to things like, libraries or community centers, but also when it comes down to access to other kinds of public service, including things like city inspections. We will talk about this particular issue and the role that city inspections play in making sure that we have fair housing access a lot more extensively in the next session. But this is really one of those sort of like key points or triggers when it comes to people being able to access things like public safety inspections. There are two big lingering questions that I think are important when we think about the Minnesota Human Rights Act today. The first is that there's some dispute regarding whether the act provides for disparate impact liability, despite that otherwise deny language. Now, interestingly, there are a lot of early court decisions that seem to say, yes, disparate impact liability does exist under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And then there was a case, it was a pro se case. So in other words, the person was representing themselves. It was unpublished at the Minnesota Court of Appeals, and it included a lot of different causes of action. So they were making a ton of different claims. And in that case, the court indicated that disparate impact was not available under the Minnesota Human Rights Act. However, there is sort of subsequent analysis that seems to push back against that. And it's an issue that I think is very likely to have a test case sometime in the very near future. There is also language in some cases coming out of the Minnesota Supreme Court that seem to indicate a real openness to disparate impact, including in a case called Fletcher, which is about Minneapolis's ordinance that says you cannot discriminate against people for having Section 8 housing choice vouchers, and that source of income discrimination does indeed protect people who want to use Section 8 vouchers. The second really big lingering issue under the Minnesota Human Rights Act that is definitely going to be a topic of conversation, and a lot of people raised this, is source of income protections. So as I said earlier, the plain language of the Minnesota Human Rights Act indicates that people are protected from discrimination because of source of income. And in addition, it goes on to define source of income as including different kinds of housing supports. But there was a case a little while back called Edwards, where the Minnesota Court of Appeals basically said that you could discriminate against somebody, or you could say you will not accept housing choice vouchers if you weren't doing it for a discriminatory reason based on source of income, but if you had a business reason for not accepting housing choice vouchers. And it really drew kind of a funky and difficult to navigate line between those two things. And that was when we started to see so many places just say no Section 8. Right. And that case has kind of stood for a really long time, but there are a couple of things that have happened subsequent to that. The first was that the city of Minneapolis passed their ordinance that very clearly said that now, if you say no Section 8, that is discrimination based on income, source of income. The second is that there are a number of cases that are in various stages that are really looking to sort of reopen the conversation that happened in Edwards. So between the Fletcher case, which is the Minneapolis ordinance, and some other cases that are pretty powerful test cases that really distinguish sets of circumstances from what was happening in the Edwards case, I think that there is very likely to be some movement in this area. There have also been a number of efforts to slightly amend the Minnesota Human Rights Act to further clarify that source of income protections do mean Section 8 housing choice vouchers. One of the reasons that this is very important is because very frequently people won't accept Section 8 housing choice vouchers. And so while waiting lists are long and people wait for years to get that voucher, the golden ticket, there are very few places that are willing to accept the housing choice vouchers. And frequently they are only in properties where they are required to accept them due to some sort of source of funding for them. So it really limits the impact of the housing choice voucher program and leaves a lot of people without a place to use the vouchers when they finally receive them. Next slide. So I wanted to just pull out, touch on whether it would be appropriate to file a fair housing complaint with the state rather than the federal government. So that is a good question. The state versus the federal government is really going to come down to, so if it's an administrative complaint, it's through the federal government, it's through HUD. And if it is a Human Rights Act complaint, it's through the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. For filing a legal case, whether you choose the state or the federal courts, typically whoever is bringing the case gets to sort of choose where they're going to first venue it. But oftentimes, when the if it includes a fair housing argument, it can be removed to federal court, and because there are rules about which courts have jurisdiction. So a lot of the time, I would say right now, state courts are actually a more favorable place to be in for many different issues, particularly our Minnesota Supreme Court. So can Section 8 acceptance be required as a condition of a development agreement where the city is providing funding? Yes, absolutely it can be. It can be required as an agreement for funding. It can be required as an agreement for making any kind of zoning changes or conditional use permits. So if somebody is asking the city to do something, you can require them to accept vouchers as a condition of that. It's also a condition of other kinds of funding as well, too. For example, the NOAA Impact Fund, which is, the fund to preserve unsubsidized affordable housing, requires that the people who tap into that fund accept housing choice vouchers. So philanthropic dollars sometimes require that. So anytime that you have an ability to sort of create conditions related to housing, you can include acceptance of housing choice vouchers as a part of that. I wanted to pull out some local examples because I think, and people touched on a little bit of this in some earlier comments as well too. So one of the things I would just say, and the statistics that the Met Council puts together show this, is by far the biggest need for housing in the metro area is for households at 30% and below area median income. So that's where the biggest gaps exist in terms of the type of housing that exists versus the people who need the housing. And disproportionately, because of disparities in income, households who are at 30% and below AMI are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, people of color households, also households with disabilities. And very little of the new production of affordable housing is at 30% below AMI. There are some really good recent examples, especially when you have local policies who are encouraging inclusionary practices, like for example, or funding that requires targeting at 30% below AMI. So we've seen a number of developments where like 20% of the units are at 30 and the rest are at 60% AMI. But it typically is only happening when there is either a policy that is requiring it or funding that is requiring it. And this lack of housing for lowest income households and how that is a very disparate issue is a major fair housing issue that is affecting virtually every planning or development decision that's happening today in the metro area. And it happens sort of on both sides of the equation, right? As people have mentioned, very frequently we run into these issues where there is going to be resistance to or pushback about the creation of affordable housing, especially deeply affordable housing. So that becomes one set of considerations. Then another set of considerations is that this is the area of the greatest need. And if we want to address disparities in our housing system, we need to create opportunities that are affordable and that are accessible and free from discriminatory barriers. Next slide. So occasionally, this will manifest itself into resistance to deeply affordable housing, and this definitely has consequences. Now, some of these are old examples because we have all collectively gotten smarter and recognized the need for affordable housing. But back in 2004, the city of Forest Lake mayor and council opposed an affordable housing development on the basis of what the comp plan said. It said they wouldn't allow affordable housing, and they actively advocated against the development at community meetings, denied a conditional use permit. And there was a fair housing case that was filed that subsequently led to compensation for the developer, required staff training on fair housing, and agreement to allow the development to move forward. And so sometimes you will see the origin of resistance coming from city councils and city staff. That is far less common today than it was back in 2004. Once again, because there has been, I think, an increased awareness of the need for affordable housing to address fair housing concerns, and also the need just for the economic growth and vitality of communities. Next slide. Another example is Creekside Commons, where there was intense opposition to deeply affordable housing in Minneapolis's Tangletown neighborhood. The consequence of that is it certainly, the project was allowed to move forward, but the delay, and that was Forest Lake, Minnesota. The delay increased the per unit cost by over $40,000 per unit and led to a reduction in the number of housing opportunities. So resistance to affordable housing development doesn't always lead to the development going away, but sometimes it increases the cost and decreases the impact of that development. And finally, Medina Woods, which is a 32-unit tax credit development, it had municipal support and then got huge opposition from the community for the rezoning. Ultimately, they reduced the size of the property and it increased the total development costs by over $80,000 per housing unit. So once again, when this pushback happens, a lot of the time, the consequence is we're able to do a lot less and it costs a lot more money because costs of housing development oftentimes comes down to time, right? There are holding costs all along the way, and it also scale matters in this as well too. Next slide. I'm not going to spend much time on this. I'm sure everybody is aware of the Metropolitan Council need numbers to allow communities to plan. One of the things that I think is really important to note is this is not the total need, right? This is just the share of the additional growth that we're going to see in different kinds of communities. So I would think about those need numbers as sort of the bottom end of what communities actually need. But it does provide important guidance to communities as they're thinking about targeting affordable housing and meeting those fair housing goals within a community, particularly when you think in the context of planning and zoning and funding decisions. CHAZ data, though, indicates that there is a need for more and deeper affordability really across the metro area, and there is no place in the Twin Cities metropolitan area that does not have a need for more housing at 30% below area median income. Next slide. We're going to touch on this a lot more in our third session, where we're talking a little bit more about proactive policies that cities can put into effect to both create housing opportunities at 30% below area median income, but also really to sort of prevent displacement of households who are lowest income. This is just a list of some of the ideas, including inclusionary policies, financial tools, anti-displacement policies, NOAA preservation, code enforcement, and then really one of the things that we've heard the most from folks in the housing development space is having an open door approach towards affordable housing development and being vocal supporters of affordable housing development. A lot of the costs of housing are at the front end, and so it is very difficult for developers to spend a lot of money to create deep affordability if they're going to create a lot of roadblocks. Having vocal support from cities oftentimes really helps those developers feel like they can accomplish what they're setting out to do in the community. Next slide. So a couple current issues in fair housing that are popping up in the news quite a lot, and that have current cases or impending cases that I think are really important for people to know about. One is, I am sure folks have seen in the news some of the stories about discrimination in housing appraisals. This is something that I think people always knew was happening to a certain extent, but there are some very dramatic examples from frequently it's either paired testing of appraisals on the same house or sort of semi-anecdotal information about people who, got an appraisal and then took out all of the sort of indicators of race or ethnicity, presented it as a white-owned house, and in the same community with the same house ended up with significantly higher appraisal levels. One of the reasons why this is such an important issue is because a lot of household wealth is tied up in home ownership, and appraisals become sort of the barometer of how much you can sell those houses for. And this has been happening in particular with Black and Latinx homeowners, but it's been happening for people of other protected classes as well. Frequently, if these patterns happen significantly in a community, you'll see the housing values in the entire neighborhood being really undervalued. But it also bars access to people who are trying to access home ownership opportunities as well too. As I had mentioned earlier, it's those appraisals that very frequently limit the amount that you can get a mortgage for. But if you have real estate investment trusts or investor owners who can buy cash, they don't need to meet those appraisal requirements in order to purchase a home. And so it both limits people's wealth creation and home ownership and limits people's access to opportunities for home ownership. Shayna has a hand up.
Thanks for saying my name right, Margaret. It's Shayna, or you're welcome to call me Shay. I want to say thank you so much. This is such an excellent presentation. This has been the most substantive, high quality training I've been to in like 2-3 years. I'm just too ecstatic and energized. I wanted to say too, Margaret, I also wanted to point out that as you so well eloquently highlighted that this that the appraisal can be there could be disparities in appraisal. You know, as you mentioned, like folks have brought down their photos of their African-American family members and had a white male friend or coworker pretend to be the housing owner or the homeowner. And then, you know, we see it's significantly higher. I wanted to say too, that I think that to your point as well, it also eliminates how pervasive and how intrinsic institutional racism and bias is. We don't mean to, and there is a lot of different ways that we can be biased, from class to in income and education. So it's not just that we're trying to target the race only, but this is a big component of it is race. And I think that this discussion also illuminates and highlights how not only do we have to have regulation to, as you mentioned, actively address this and to overcome, but also continue to do that work as government, as institutions, as developers, to address our bias and how it manifests in our behavior and practices. So sorry, I just really felt the need to say that, and also just had to let you know it was a great presentation.
Oh, well, A, thank you, and B, yeah, that is a very good point, right? So much of the discrimination that is happening in our housing system is systemic, right? It's systems that are created that weren't created that way by accident. And while the outcomes sometimes weren't the intended ones, there were always deliberate choices that went into whatever system was created. And so a lot of the times we'll see these systems that seem like they're facially neutral, especially as more and more algorithms, for example, are being utilized in housing decisions. But really to recognize that those are sort of the culmination of a lot of issues and choices. And so it may be a lot of individual decisions that become institutional decisions that become systemic decisions. Yeah, nothing is really facially neutral. It's always going to be created through sort of a set of different factors. You know, related to that, and especially as we think about the role that algorithms are playing in our housing system, and that is disparities in lending, both in mortgages and refinancing. I don't know if folks saw, there were a number of articles that came out about lending practices. And in particular, they were looking at refinance rates for Black homeowners who had mortgages through, in this particular instance, Wells Fargo. And what they found is that the rejection rate for Black refis was 3 times higher for Black homeowners than it was for white homeowners. And these were for refinances. So really significant disparities, even though in both those instances, you have people who own an asset who are trying to refinance that home. And this was happening kind of regardless of what people's income levels were. There's a lot of data that is produced about lending practices. And if you ever get the opportunity, there is a really good analysis. You can actually break it down by city and by county. That's done by NCRC. And you can look lender by lender at the denial rates by income, by type of loan, and by race. You see these very, very dramatic disparities in who gets access to financing and who doesn't. Once again, regardless of income. The data show that a Black household who wants to access a mortgage has a higher income Black household has a higher denial rate than a lower income white household. And so one of the things that has been really interesting is recently to be seeing some of the initiatives to address homeownership disparities and the involvement of lending institutions in those conversations. However, one of the things that very rarely is getting looked at is what is underlying some of those decisions. And very frequently, one of the things that we've seen and heard, and you'll read in the literature, is the use of credit scores, which are supposedly a facially neutral algorithm or tool, but ends up with disparate results. This also comes into play in another emerging issue, which is tenant screening practices. We did some research along with a bunch of community-based organizations who were interviewing individuals about their experience with the tenant screening system, as well as we did like a literature review, and we did interviews with landlords. And one of the things that we found is that a lot of people who are trying to rent housing, whether it rises to a federal Fair Housing Act violation or not, say that they are experiencing discrimination when they are applying for housing. And it happens in both subtle and unsubtle ways. But people walk in the door and feel like they are experiencing discrimination almost from the outset of trying to access housing opportunities. The second is that the factors that go into the tenant screening system very frequently are discriminatory in a variety of ways. Some of them have been directly addressed. So for example, there was guidance that came out of HUD about the use of criminal records in tenant screening, and they required landlords not to say a blanket no criminal record, but instead to be very specific about sort of the type of offense, the history of that, because with the disparities in incarceration rates and with enforcement of laws, people of color were disproportionately being barred from access to housing because of criminal history. And a lot of it was deeply, deeply irrelevant to whether they could be successful in housing or not. But there are other factors in the tenant screening system that also are disproportionately affecting households of color, including disparities in our eviction system, as well as disparities in credit scores that lead to, in particular, Black, Indigenous, and people of color households, as well as, in particular, people with disabilities having problems accessing housing opportunities, even in the rental market, through the tenant screening system. The other thing, yes, and rent not applying to credit scores, right? The one thing that they want is people to pay the rent, but paying your rent on time doesn't apply to your credit score. The other thing that is another disparity that exists in the tenant screening system is people who have experienced domestic violence very frequently have things on their tenant screening records that are going to translate to being sort of like demerits in whatever system is being created to screen people for housing. This includes if somebody is experiencing domestic violence, a lot of the time they do not have control over their own finances. It is a form of control and manipulation. So they cannot control things like their credit score, for example. Sometimes they're limited in their ability to access job opportunities, so it affects income. And very frequently, people who experience domestic violence are intersecting with the criminal justice system in ways that will pop up on tenant screening reports as indicating that they would be bad renters, even though it is something that is nothing to do with them and everything to do with the domestic violence that they were experiencing. So this is an ongoing issue that people are continuing to work on, and there are very likely to be a number of cases about this, including, by the way, there is a major fair housing case about the tenant screening system that was filed, I think, in Connecticut, that's still kind of wending its way through the court system. And then finally, and something that we will talk about quite a lot next session, is disparate condition in multifamily housing. So that is, some people have access to housing that is safe and stable and well maintained, and other people do not. Sometimes it is within the same building, or it is buildings that are owned by the same landlord or property management company. And so the way that people are being treated relative to repair conditions or response time to housing conditions very frequently is based on a protected class as well too. Next slide. So with that, would love to open it up if anybody has any lingering questions. Here is my contact information. You may have realized I like to talk about housing. I think it's really interesting. Love to answer questions. Also, a reminder for folks that the second session, which is going to focus principally on city actions and what cities can do and how cities respond, is going to be in person. It's going to be in Brooklyn Park, and we will be sending around a registration link for that for everybody who signed up for this, as well as sending it out to the world as well too. And then our last session is going to be really about expanding housing rights. So how do we think about what cities and the state can do to really expand our idea of what it means to have access to safe, stable, affordable housing in communities across the state. The other nice thing about both of those is it won't just be me talking. So I've put together some panels of folks, and we're going to be doing them both in person. So we'll also have some time for a little bit more interactive work as well too, now that everybody is sort of grounded in some fair housing stuff. So question came up, is the second session also available in Zoom? Because we're going to be doing some discussion-based work, it's probably not going to be available on Zoom, although we will record the panels and make them available for folks. We won't be recording sort of the small group discussions, just because I think it's really important for people to feel like that's a sort of safe space for them to ask some questions. Any other burning questions folks have, or unburning questions as well too in our last 5 minutes? There are questions in the parking lot. Great. Let's see what we've got in the parking lot. Oh, wow. Okay. So let's see here. I'm expanding the questions a little bit so I can see them. So one of the first questions is, have there been newer cases since Blackjack of cities getting sued for denying projects due to public hearings where blatantly racist and discriminatory content comments were made? Yes, there have been more recent cases than Blackjack. One of the things I will say is that for what it's worth, cities have gotten more sophisticated if they want to deny a project in terms of like what rationale they use. And so that is it's kind of interesting, but yeah, there are a number of cases related to that. They pop up all the time, all over the country, really. Frequently, though, when people say that kind of stuff and then the city acts accordingly, those are the types of cases that don't even end up going through the court system. They get addressed usually administratively. Let's see. Can current residents be used either for program eligibility or leasing preference? My recollection is that city of residence can, but it seems like disparate impact. That is a really interesting question. There are some types of programs that you can use preference policies for. For example, there was a lawsuit that happened for quite some time, actually, that was based on preference policies and right to return that came out of San Francisco, that was ultimately settled between the city and HUD. There's also an ongoing case related to preference policies, and this is lease preference policies in New York. Down payment assistance programs, they can be targeted to existing communities, although you do have to be really careful about the disparate impact consequences of that. So I think it's going to really vary from community to community. A lot of the time you can address some of the challenges of the disparate impact by having further targeting. A lot of the time, the down payment assistance programs are really intended to address housing disparities. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of the time they can really target more specifically. What about cities offering housing preference to repair the damage done to racial groups who have historically been discriminated against as identified in Jim Crow of the North? Yeah, so there are a number of different ways that cities and other jurisdictions have done some level of targeting based on repairing past damage. In particular, there are provisions about creating specific kinds of mortgage products that are associated with people who have historically been denied access to mortgage lending. There are also things that people have done via different kinds of targeting with, in particular, marketing. One of the things that I would say that's really a good thing to note is that a lot of housing programs, like funding programs, require affirmative marketing requirements. So not only are you agreeing to certain levels of affordability, but you're also agreeing to market to people from historically underrepresented communities. And that actually is a really important tool when you think about housing mobility and creating housing opportunities in areas of historic white affluence. Can landlords who don't allow tenants with prior convictions be a fair housing violation, since defendants of color are often charged at higher rate than white counterparts? Yes. So once again, there was some HUD guidance on that came out a few years ago. It's actually very, very good. And we can share it with the group as well too, about the use of prior convictions in screening. And when it says you can only use it if it's relevant, and it depends on the nature of the offense and the timing of the offense. This is also an issue that a lot of research has been done on. And in particular, there is no correlation between people being bad renters and having a conviction for, in particular, misdemeanor offenses. And particularly once you're 2 years after a conviction, it has virtually no bearing on people's success in housing. Is there a sense yet of how the current Supreme Court might gut the Fair Housing Act, or how rulings in other cases, e.g. administrative college admission, might have an impact. So we don't know. There are a number of cases that are floating around that could potentially be a cause for concern. And there are some issues where there's what's called a circuit split. So you have one Court of Appeals who's decided one thing and another Court of Appeals that's decided something else. I am not aware of any specific Fair Housing Act case that is currently going through that issue. However, there are some adjacent issues that are really kind of troubling, including there's one case that came through the Eighth Circuit, Heights v. Walls, which seems to have one of the most expansive definitions of property rights. And so, you know, there are a number of cases that could be coming up. The other thing I would say just in general is that the current Supreme Court doesn't seem to care terribly much about even recent precedent. And so that can be, once again, it's certainly a flag that I think everybody who cares about housing is watching. Does somebody have to prove disability, e.g. doctor's note, re the need for a service animal? And something we can often get asked, can a landlord charge a fee for a dog that is a service animal? So second question first, my understanding is that they cannot charge a pet fee for a dog that is a service animal because it is not a pet, it is a service animal. Do they have to prove disability, e.g. a doctor's note? I don't want to wade into something that I do not feel competent to speak to. My understanding is that you can require some level of proof of the need for a reasonable accommodation, but I don't know specifically what proof is necessary for service animals, and don't want to lead people astray. But that is certainly an issue that I can look up and get back to people on, because I know those issues do come up fairly regularly. Disability status does tend to be a tricky one as well too, because, you know, I know for the purposes of hiring, for example, you cannot inquire as to what the specific disability is. You can only inquire as to what the needed accommodation is. And then are 3 strikes rules for police calls as grounds for revoking rental housing licenses, Fair Housing Act violations. We would argue that yes, those would be, especially if they are 3 strikes rules for police calls versus, because a lot of the time, that will happen in a way that has a disparate impact on households with children, people with disabilities, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color households. There have been a number of examples where cities have been challenged on those types of 3 strikes rules and been compelled to revise or overturn them. A little bit would depend a touch on kind of like what the evidence is that it would be creating a disparate impact. But if you can show a disparate impact, then yeah, that would very likely trigger at least some significant Fair Housing Act concerns. And I think that is all of the questions that are currently living in the parking lot. I know I didn't have answers to everything because I don't want to be wrong. So I will get back to people with answers. Also, just a final call for folks, if you have any specific questions or issues or concerns that you want to raise or anything that you want to share with the group. Well, once again, thank you so much to everybody for spending your time here today. Once again, super excited for us to do the second and third sessions. Once again, many, many thanks to everybody who helped inform this and pull it together. And if you have any additional questions, please, by all means, let me know, and we will be sending out the registration link to folks for the next session. So thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.